It's the 21st of April 2020, Yom HaShoah. We're on the outskirts of the city of Auschwitz, in Yiddish called Eshpizim, but in the time period of 1939 till 1945 it was renamed under the German Nazi occupation after being included into the Third Reich as Auschwitz. Behind me is the so-called Stammlager, the first camp that was created here and which started to take in inmates in June of 1940. It's Yom HaShoah. It's a very special day. It's a very special day especially for Holocaust memory and especially for Auschwitz. This is the day when you march from Auschwitz to Birkenau. I was all the time afraid that due to this pandemic that we go through right now, there will be nobody marching today. I think I owe it to the people I was working with, but also to the last 25 years of my quest in commemorating Holocaust and my quest of doing Jewish genealogy in Central Europe to be here today. So please march with me. I believe this march will not be a lonely march, but all of the people I've met, all of the people I've learned from, and all of the people that were planning to come and hopefully will come in the future will be here with me today. I believe that making memory and commemorating is about certain gestures. It's about certain rituals that we shall all commit into. But making memory is also about education. So let's use this walk today of 3 kilometers, around 2 miles from Auschwitz to Birkenau, in order to learn a little bit about this territory which was in between those two largest parts of Auschwitz complex. This territory all belonged to the so-called Interessengebiet, the zone of interest. This larger territory in a peripheral area of a couple of dozens of kilometers would have over 40 subcamps of Auschwitz. But this very vicinity of Auschwitz I and Birkenau still has a lot of historical artifacts which are extremely important for the history of the Holocaust and the history of the 20th century. Also, there are certain places like the nearby gravel pit of Auschwitz I, which became cornerstones of Polish-Jewish conflict in the 1980s and 90s, and then evolved gradually into Polish-Jewish dialogue. So please join me on this walk from Auschwitz to Birkenau in the 21st of April of 2020, Yom HaShoah. So we are in one of the corners of Auschwitz I right now, the so-called Stammlager, the first camp that was constructed here, the first one to take inmates, the one that will later on give the name of Auschwitz to the entire enormously growing complex of camps and subcamps and labor places, growing ultimately within a very short time period from June of 1940 into the late of 1944 or liberation in January 45, growing into one of the largest systems of abuse of slave labor that Europe has ever seen. At the peak of construction of Auschwitz-Birkenau as a complex, we are talking of over 130,000 of inmates registered and condemned into slave labor for the sake of German economy. At the same time, from 1942, after the decision about the final solution of the Jewish question reaches the point of organized, industrialized murder, Auschwitz is converted into one of the massive extermination centers for European Jewish communities. So from spring of 1942, the overwhelming numbers of arriving transports here are the transports of European Jewish communities coming from all over very far ends of Europe. On our walk towards Birkenau, just next to the Lager House, which was used, as I said, as a storage for grain, flour and agricultural products, there is a very primitive structure, a very sophisticated structure of an SS Küche. The SS kitchen. This building was built for slave labor force of inmates, like the entire Auschwitz was, and this was built in 1942. It was more than a dining room for lower ranked soldiers, but also lower ranked officers would dine here. It was more than just a dining room. It was an entertainment place. It had a concert stage. It was very often a place to organize family meetings or any kind of formal staff meetings of Auschwitz, and there were plenty of those. One of such events was here on the 27th of February of 1943. And that very evening, 7 of the Polish political prisoners, most of them coming here on the first transport, so most of them coming here in June of 1940, among them Kazimierz Albin, decided to escape. They were working in this kitchen. They decided to run. They managed to bend one of the metal bars in the window of the kitchen on the back part of the building, and then 7 of them, at first kind of disorganized, but later on they get together. They run towards the end of the street where the Solar Reader is. It was late January. Kazimierz Albin remembers the river was partly covered with ice, and they started to make it to the river, then trying to wear their clothing and run. This was one of the successful escapes. All of this Nazi complex of structures was connected with a system of underground tunnels. From 1944, the Allied planes taking off either in Brindisi in Italy or in Poltava behind the Russian front line in the east, they are starting to get an early reach to fly over Auschwitz. The large building on the right hand side, just next to the Küche building, was built also. They started to construct it in World War I. It was never fully building-wise finished, but it became an enormous warehouse for the camp, with many inmates employed in there. One of those inmates that completely through the glimpse of chance was employed in this building was a Jewish inmate from Łomża, Cecilia Cybulska. She was deported to the camp of Auschwitz with her family from Łomża, her parents, her sister and her 2 brothers. All of them were murdered in this initial time period of stay of the Cybulski family in Birkenau. But then Cecilia is transferred to work here. And this is the place where she's meeting a Polish political prisoner. One more time, a man from the first transport of Polish political prisoners from June of 1940. His name is Jerzy Bielecki. And they fell in love. They fell in love and they plan to run. Or actually, Jerzy plans to run. Their relation comes to the point when Cecilia is absolutely terrified. She, as a Jewish inmate, is undergoing a very regular persecutions. She witnessed one of her good friends being just shot in the street by an SS officer. She's absolutely terrified, and this is when Jerzy is promising her that he's going to do everything to take her away from this place. Cecilia Cybulska and those Jewish girls that are working in this warehouse are actually led to stay or led to sleep in the basement of this building. This is the so-called Stabsgebäude, one of the main administrative buildings. Across the street, as we are already here, was the main bakery of Auschwitz. But returning to our Cyla Cybulska and Jerzy Bielecki story, Jerzy Bielecki has promised to organize an escape, and he did. It was in late July of 1944. Cyla was already moved from this warehouse work. She was made here to fix, to repair the bags for flour. But at a certain point she went missing from this job. She was being given another job, so she went missing from the eyes of Jerzy that was employed here. He managed to connect and contact people to get a note at a certain point that right now Cyla is employed in the camp's laundry. So he's coming to the camp's laundry and he's telling Cyla that just the next day, 21st of July 1944, there will be an SS officer coming to take her into an interrogation. The next day, here comes Jerzy, all dressed up in an SS uniform. He was working for months, using all of his camp contacts in order to, piece by piece, assemble an SS uniform for himself. He had a very good conduct of German. He also managed to arrange for a friend of his a one-time passage or permission to leave the camp territory with an inmate. It was a permission issued for one SS soldier, one SS officer and an inmate. And this is what he did. He came to the laundry. He took Cyla Cybulska with her into interrogation, and they just walked out of Auschwitz. Their permission was validated. It was okay. And then they started to run. They started to run south towards the Beskid Mountains, and they went into the house of the uncle of Jerzy. And this is the point where they are deciding to separate. They are deciding that for separation they are going to double the chances. In case of anything going wrong, only one of them will be found. So Jerzy is joining the partisans, Jerzy is joining the Polish Home Army, and Cyla is being hidden in one of the farmhouses in Poland. Then after the war finishes, both of them are becoming victims of a certain misinformation. Cyla is coming out of hiding and through Łomża in order to see what is there and to literally pick up the pieces. She is emigrating or going into medical treatment into Sweden, Stockholm. Yes, the Scandinavian countries were among the first ones to open their borders after the war finished to refugees. So Cyla is in Stockholm. Jerzy is coming out of her as a partisan. Of course, she is asking for Cyla. And the information he is getting from the family that was hiding him is that she has left. And then when he's inquiring more, he's being told that she died in a hospital in Stockholm. When Cyla is asking for Jerzy, when she comes out of hiding, the information she gets is that he was killed as a partisan. So they parted. Only in the early 1980s, and as I said before, the 1980s was a breakthrough time period for constructing memory and talking about the Holocaust, and the time when the survivors started to communicate and were asked questions. There's an older lady in New York talking in 1983 to her Polish cleaning lady in the apartment, and this older lady wants to speak Polish, and she tells her story of an escape from Auschwitz. She tells her story of falling in love and of running away. And this Polish cleaning lady is telling her, hold on. I remember watching a documentary movie in Poland, in the Polish Communist TV, of a man called Jerzy, who is a director of a school somewhere in southern Poland, and he tells exactly the same story. So it didn't take long. In mid-80s, Zilla jumped on a plane. She landed in Warsaw, and she was welcomed by Jerzy Bielecki, holding 39 roses for the last 39 years of separation. So that's the story of love and escape of Zilla Cebulska and Jerzy Bielecki from Auschwitz. We are right now on the other end of this administrative German Nazi complex. As you can see, there's another entry or outing from this underground anti-aircraft bunkers. So we are at the very entrance to Auschwitz I, the Stammlager. This is the parking lot which most or almost all of the visitors that visit Auschwitz Museum every year would start with. Over the last 20 years, the number of visitors, from 500,000 of them in the early 90s, went up into the recent numbers of 2.3 million of visitors a year. It's a tremendous challenge, a tremendous responsibility for the museum as an institution to cater to this kind of diversified number of tourists and visitors. And those are people coming from all kinds of places in the world, with all kinds of understanding or lack of understanding of history. And in this museum, being confronted with the physicality of the site and being guided by over 300 guides that work here, they gain awareness. For most of those people, it will be the first and the last time in their history when they are consciously spending 15-20 conscious minutes, or maybe 3.5 hours of a conscious visit to Auschwitz-Birkenau, on thinking about World War II and on thinking about genocide. So in my opinion, this very fact is putting a tremendous responsibility on the museum and on the guides themselves to do their narrative work as good as they can. And they do this work tremendously well. But as we are here at this parking lot, at the very entrance to the museum itself, a place which is normally crowded by a couple of thousands of people, this is also the place from which the March of the Living is starting its path from Auschwitz I to Auschwitz to Birkenau, which is behind you. Right behind this main entry building into Auschwitz is the Arbach Mafai main entrance gate. Probably one of the most iconic pieces of Holocaust and Auschwitz memory. As I said in the beginning, memory is about following certain rites, certain ceremonies, but memory is also very visual. We remember under certain conditions. We need a survivor, we need a witness, we need somebody to tell us that it happened. We need somebody to put a testimony describing us the situation, the historical time, the circumstances, and describing us, him or her, inside this history. So one of the important elements of memory is having an eyewitness, having a survivor in case of Auschwitz or in case of genocide. Another critically important element of memory being formed is the physicality of the place. Is having some kind of physicality to which you can attach this memory, to which you can attach what you hear, what you read, what you see on motion films. And in case of Auschwitz, and almost Auschwitz only, in cases of German Nazi concentration and death camps, this condition exists. This condition of physicality exists. The camp is here, physically almost entirely preserved the way how it was looking like when it was liberated. And believe me, it wouldn't be so if it wouldn't be for the last over 70 years of a tremendous museum work that is happening here day by day, hour by hour. A work of preservation and a work of education. So the museum that exists here is absolutely fundamental in making the physicality of Auschwitz last. And at the same time, the physicality of Auschwitz lasting is fundamental for us remembering of it. To make it more simple, it will be very hard to remember Holocaust without the Abba Mafai main entrance gate, which became the icon. It will be very hard to remember the Holocaust without the testimonies of close to 100,000 of survivors that were still alive in 1945 after the camp was liberated. So, in my opinion, the two fundamental elements of constructing memory of any historical event, but in particular a genocide, is the existence of physicality of a certain site and the existence of a survivor. If you look into the other German Nazi concentration death camps, there is only one other place which physically exists, and this is Majdanek. And this was the reason why right after the war in the year of 1947, by the decision of the Polish Communist government, those two were commemorated as museums and decided to be preserved. Whereas thousands of other former camp territories were reused for some other purposes, or left alone to be commemorated later. From the 6 German Nazi death camps that we talk about today, so Auschwitz-Birkenau, Majdanek, which in the German Nazi planning were conducting two functions in one place, so the function of concentration and the function of mass extermination of European Jews. From those two camps, only those two camps are having remnants preserved and physically exist. On top of those two, there were also those immediate death centers. We actually even right now try to escape from calling them camps, rather call them the death centers, extermination centers. And those chronologically are Chełmno on the Ner River, Bełżec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Those 4 are being built swiftly in winter of 1941-42, or in spring, or Treblinka in summer 42, and they had just one simple function: the function of mass extermination of as many European, or actually in case of those 4 Polish Jews, as it's possible. Most of those camps, those 4 that I've mentioned, Treblinka, Sobibor, Bełżec and Chełmno, they've existed for a little bit over 1 year. To begin with, they were built very temporarily to be taken apart. In most cases, the only solid building with foundations on the territory of those camps was a gas chamber to murder. All of the rest of the structures were temporarily wooden. They existed for a little bit over 1 year, and then they were dismantled. So most of those places, by the end of 1943, so way before the war finishes, are gone, are physically dismantled. The places are blown over. The corpses were exhumed and burned. The remnants were scattered around. The barracks were moved somewhere else. And also there were scarcely any survivors. So this is putting a tremendous pressure on Auschwitz, because in case of Auschwitz, and almost Auschwitz only, you have those 2 fundamental elements of memory existing: the physicality of the place and the survivors. I'm on the private territory right now, so I can unveil my nose and mouth mask a little bit. in this day and age of COVID pandemia. Private it was. We are exactly on the way, marching from Auschwitz I to Auschwitz to Birkenau. We are just before crossing on the bridge passage over the international rail junction, which was one of the critical elements facilitating Auschwitz's existence and murderous functionality. So we are on the march track. And along this path, hidden in the bushes and trees, overgrown and forgotten, are dozens and dozens of former factories, private enterprises, private investors who, in the day and age of Auschwitz's existence, in the 40s, could not lose this chance and opportunity not to invest. Yes, from the point of view of European economy, definitely German and Austrian economy, but also European and to a certain extent global economy, there was probably no better place to invest your money in the 40s but Auschwitz. It was stable under the German Nazi cruel regime of occupation. It was providing an ever-growing number of slave labor force that you could employ on large, massive contracts signed by the camp commandant with dozens of various private companies. And this situation, from the point of view of industrial planning, seemed at that time of 1940 or 41 to be eternal, to last forever. Believe me, in 1940, just after the swift victory of next and next of the European countries, nobody in Nazi Germany was thinking that this entire German Nazi regime will last for 4 or 5 years only. The belief was in the eternal Third Reich that they are building. And such was to be Auschwitz. Actually, in 5 years of its existence, from 1940 to its liberation in 1945, Auschwitz is only all the time in the phase of investment. Auschwitz is all the time in the phase of investing money by either SS and different associates of SS or private money into constructing of this monstrous Auschwitz system. So yes, by the time when the camp is being liberated, they haven't even started to massively benefit from the long-term investments that started here immediately after the camp was started. As we've already established, the first transport of inmates was deported to Auschwitz in June of 1940. Very soon after, the German industry is coming to negotiate investment deals with the camp staff. One of the first massive companies known at that time period was the large chemical conglomerate of BASF. At this stage, it was already clustered into the German Nazi industrial clusters. The cluster that it was put into was called IG Farben. But within this cluster of IG Farben, there were multiple other sub-brands existing. The brands we know today. One of them is BASF. So the engineers of BASF already in late of 1940 are starting to negotiate the location of a humongous plant somewhere in the vicinity of Auschwitz. Location, location, location. The place that was chosen is about 8-9 miles from Auschwitz Stammlager, from Auschwitz main camp. It was located in the village called Monowice. For this reason, later on, historically, it was known in the German terminology as Auschwitz for Monowitz. But a part of those large key players, there were also dozens and dozens of smaller companies which would come in with a hope of profit, which were completely obliterating any morally or ethics, or they were reprogrammed to believe in the new Nazi ethics, in the ethics of a super German, an Obermensch, in the ethics of exploitation, in the ethics of trying to legalize everything they do, and by the legalization itself, self-convincing themselves that it's ethically and morally fine. This is what the totalitarian regimes do to their societies. This is how the totalitarian regimes, step by step, reprogram their societies through taking little slices, through applying something which in the world of politics and political sciences we call salami tactics, cutting little pieces. Ironically, this is something we might see even now. In the day and age when certain countries in the world are fighting or supposedly fighting with a pandemic, they will also never use a chance to take away certain political slices for themselves. So we have to be very careful and aware about the freedoms we are right now temporarily deprived of, in order to ask and demand for those freedoms to be back on the very first day when the medical situation will only allow it. But returning to Auschwitz, we are on the path from Auschwitz I to Auschwitz to Birkenau. We are standing in a derelict, enormous factory. This was investment by another large known European industrial complex, Krupp. Krupp, without S at the end at first, was known since the beginning of 20th century as one of the largest ammunition and armament producers. Still is. So, a corporation like this would never miss a chance of investing in Auschwitz. They're investing their money already in 1941. Construction of this huge industrial complex lasts for 1941-42. They're planning a factory of fuses for projectiles and rockets, which was very high-tech at that time period. Of course, everything based on the slave labor force of Auschwitz inmates. As I've already mentioned earlier, at the peak of development of the entire larger Auschwitz complex of over 40 subcamps, the German labor administration has close to 130,000 of registered inmates to be traded, to be sold into the hands of those private employees. So Krups is investing tremendously. Ultimately, Krups does not finish this investment. When it's opened in 1942, because of an ownership change, it's open under the name of Weissel Metal Unionwerker. And it was still a company producing fuses for projectiles. A company in which a couple of hundreds of inmates of Auschwitz and Birkenau would be employed. If this employer was somewhere close within this very peripheral area around Auschwitz fences, and we are literally less than 1 mile from Abach-Marfai Gate, and around 1 mile behind me is Birkenau. If those factories were closed, then inmates would have been marched. They were walked to their daily jobs. Of course, everything was regulated on the contract signed in between the camp of Auschwitz and the corporation itself. If this employer happened to be more distant place, 10 miles, 20 miles, a coal mine, a fishing pond, an agricultural estate, steelwork, pretty much the larger Interessengebiet, the larger zone of influence of Auschwitz, economical influence of Auschwitz, marked by the Nazis during the war, was encompassing 40 square kilometers. It technically meant that every bit of profit that is made on this territory is somehow commissioned by Auschwitz and generated mostly with the usage of the slave labor force of Auschwitz inmates. And to say more, it was Auschwitz and Auschwitz only from within those 6 German Nazi death camps in which the German Nazis connected 2 functions in one place. The function of a tremendous and growing concentration camp, starting in 1940, liberated in 1945, was connected from 1942 with the function of mass extermination of European Jews. So yes, the German Nazis, in case of a camp that we are slowly marching into, in case of Auschwitz to Birkenau, have connected those 2 functions in one place. They've connected the function of mass extermination of European Jews with the function of mass exploitation of slave labor force. And what are the implications of these decisions? This decision might have been right now understood as a certain logistical mistake. Why? Because by doing so, they've generated survivors. By doing so, they were running the mass extermination, sophisticated gas chambers and crematoriums in the back of Birkenau behind us in the full visibility of close to 90,000 of inmates that were stationed at the peak of capacity of Birkenau camp, which was just over the fences from the mass extermination facilities. Yes, today you can stand still in the midst of a selection platform in Birkenau with a survivor like Irene Weiss that was deported from Munkac, around Munkac, in late May of 1945. And this survivor standing in the midst of Birkenau can tell you the details about the selection, about the physicians, about the buildings, about the fear, about the separation. We have survivors. Those who were registered to be slave labor. Only some of those survived. And they are one of the major assets of memory. They are one of the major conditions under which we remember what happened in Auschwitz. And also, for historians like me, they are one of the essential conditions for making us understand the facts of what was life in Auschwitz and how it was happening. So in case of Auschwitz and Birkenau, those 2 functionalities were being put together, the functionality of exploitation of slave labor force and mass extermination. And by taking this decision, the German Nazis are mass exterminating close to 1 million of European Jews in the full visibility of potential survivors in the future. Of course, when they take this decision in 1942, nobody's anticipating that this history is going to finish anyhow differently than with a giant victory of the Third Reich. By 1942, spring, they are victorious on each and every front line. By 1942, the sense of security within the Third Reich is tremendous. So everything they do here, they do for the eternity. So they don't anticipate that the fact of mass extermination in the view of thousands of prisoners that are working in a factory like this is a problem. Because the victors are controlling the history. So the German Nazis are going to write a history. The victims will be never given a voice. So irony has it that 5 years later, the war finished differently, and most importantly, which I'm trying to stress all the time, there were survivors of Auschwitz. To give you numbers, from a little bit over 400,000 of registered inmates of Auschwitz, so people who came on the train and were being given a number and became the labor asset of the camp, we are estimating right now that after the war finished, it's very hard to estimate this number, but we are estimating right now that by the time the war finished in 1945, there might have been about 100,000 of those who've been to Auschwitz and are still alive. From 400,000 of those registered into 100,000 of potential survivors. Which is also proving the fact that selection and being registered into the camp does not mean that you are the lucky one. To put it into the words of a couple of survivors I was working with, selection into the labor, selection into being registered meant only one thing. Your death sentence was extended in time. And yes, if you look at the statistics of 400,000 registered and 100,000 surviving, you have 1 in 4 of a chance. But there were survivors, and that's critically important. So standing in this location of an abandoned factory, it's very important to understand the morally and ethics in business. It's very important to understand the limitations of legality in business. It's very important to understand that the legality and seemingly legal behavior does not always accommodate the morally and ethics. Or it may accommodate the morally and ethics, which is dramatically changed. Changed in a way so that a civilized country in Europe is able to involve itself in all possible levels of society, industry, culture, philosophy, thinking, into a perfectly organized industrial genocide of European Jews, just like it happened here close to 8 years ago. Well, the German Nazis made an investment into something which was called the Bahnhof West. So the western train station, which we are right now looking at. This western train station was located exactly in between Auschwitz I, that we are coming from, and Auschwitz II Birkenau. somewhere where you can see those white cubicle structures, which is one station house and some storage of rail materials. Somewhere there was the so-called Alte Judenrampe, the old Jewish unloading platform, the first original platform into which almost each and every inmate and victim of Auschwitz would come within the years of 1940 and May of 1944. The platform which we are going to see later inside of Birkenau was built only in May of 1944 and only with the function of facilitation of arrival of over 400,000 of Hungarian Jews in this race for time of summer 44. The race for time was the race for developing the transportation and murder capacity of Hungarian Jews as fast and as high as it gets, because the war was running to an end. In May of 19... In spring of 1944, so relatively late in the history of the Holocaust, at the time when the fate of the war was decided. The German Nazis were losing it, and losing it decisively. The Soviet front line was only about 250 kilometers east of here. The first territories of contemporary Poland were entered by the Soviet army, some people would say liberated, already in July of 1944. The concentration and death camp of Majdanek was liberated on the 22nd of July of 1944. This is the moment at which humanity as we know it at that time period, which means the Allies themselves and their societies, are starting to have a full pictorial and factual evidence of what were the German Nazi concentration camps. There are journalists, photojournalists from New York Times, LA Times and other newspapers sent to the just regained territories by the Soviets, and they are covering with pictures showing the details of whereabouts of Majdanek, showing the gas chambers, showing the crematoriums and so forth. First of such materials and articles in New York Times you can already read in late August of 1944. At the same time period, on the just brand new build rail spur that we are following, and this was a rail spur which was built in May of 1944, the massive transports of Jews from mostly Hungary at first, and then other parts of Europe are starting to be transported to the death camp of Birkenau. So the rail spur that we're following is running just parallel to the so-called Black Road that we are following. This is a little road connecting the Alte Judenrampe, the old Jewish unloading platform, with the camp of Birkenau, or even more so, connecting it with the back part of Birkenau. So connecting it with the death facilities of crematoriums and gas chambers that were located in the very back part of Birkenau itself. From 1944 May, the rail spur would be entering through the main gate of Birkenau to bring the cattle cars with 430,000 of Hungarian Jews deported here from the 27th of May till mid-July 1944. Well, mid-July 44, the first parts of Hungary have been liberated by the Soviets, which literally stops the train service, in some cases with people, Hungarian Jews, liberated from the trains that were stopped by the Soviet army. So for those people, liberation it was. But then, after the Hungarian direction of transportation is no longer possible, they start to bring along this rail spur into the new platform inside of Birkenau the remaining Jews from the Łódź Lodz gets to. Close to 60,000 of those were still alive. Those are only the selected survivors of 4 years of existence of Łódź Ghetto, and the Łódź Ghetto starts in February of 1940, becoming the second largest ghetto in occupied Europe, just after Warsaw. The Łódź Ghetto, when it starts very early in February 1940, it's accommodating around 280,000 of Łódź Jews, and the Jews from the vicinity as well, including really large numbers of international Jewish transports that were dumped into the Łódź Ghetto beginning in 1941. Mostly Jewish transports from Germany. There is a tremendous pressure generated and created through the means of propaganda, education, and a changed Nazi culture, there's a tremendous pressure on getting rid of the Jews somehow. This pressure is very strong and vital even before the war starts. One of the first massive, brutal events showing this social pressure to rid of the Jews from the German and Austrian society is obviously the Kristallnacht of November 1938. But with continued propaganda and more Nazi-style education into the classrooms, this tide is rising. So in 1940-41, it wasn't uncommon that the inhabitants of German Austrian cities are actually demanding from their local Nazi authorities to do something. They're actually demanding so that the Jewish family that is sharing an apartment building in Vienna with me is disappearing somewhere, is going somewhere. If they are called all those names, and if they are identified as rodents and lices, why shall my Bertha play with Rivka? Do something. Find a solution. So under this tremendous social pressure in Germany and Austria, already in 1941, so before the final decision about a murder is sealed, there are transports of mostly German and Czech Jews into some of the ghettos in that time occupied Poland, to put them there waiting for the next developments, which were already in planning but needed a little bit of fine-tuning. So we are approaching another iconic element of Auschwitz topography, the main entrance gate to Auschwitz, to Birkenau. So we came here from the place which is on the horizon, the so-called Alte Judenrampe, which is right behind this electric post, which you can see on the horizon line. And we were following this international rail spur, which was built in 1944 in May. And this rail spur intersects the road and enters through the main entrance gate of Birkenau into the camp itself. It enters into the new platform that was built inside of Auschwitz in May of 1944, and it was obviously built with one particular purpose: in order to increase the reception and at the same time extermination capacity of Birkenau complex. To increase this capacity in the last stages of war, when the extermination and the war itself is coming to an end. At the same time period when this rail line was extended, the Allied planes taking off from either Brindisi or Poltava are starting to get an aerial reach into the Auschwitz complex. So you can still meet survivors of Birkenau Auschwitz who remember seeing and of course hearing the massive bombardment by the Allied planes, bombardments of only the industrial complexes similar to the one we've been at. Mostly bombardments of the 12 kilometers away from here complex of IG Farben, BASF. For those people hearing those bombardments, mostly in June and then in August of 1944, it was almost an immediate promise of freedom. Most of those survivors, I remember, they were convinced that after seeing the first planes bombarding the complex, it's a matter of days now. Probably would they be told in this very moment of June, or July or August of 1944 that it will be another year because it will be for most of the inmates at least up until the end of 44 or January 45, stay in Auschwitz and then a death march. And then if liberation comes, it happens somewhere on the German territory in a camp into which they've survived walking. And it's only coming in April of 1945. So would they be told about the fact that it will be one more year? Probably they would drop that. The thing that makes people to continue here is hope. This little bit of hope that they cling to on a daily basis. But of course, for those aerial bombardments of the nearby territory and vicinity, the Allies are first sending the reconnaissance planes. So we have a whole series of pictures taken in the late days of May of 1944. And here you can see one of those scale pictures, which is also showing us how the entire complex was looking like. So this is Stammlager, Auschwitz I, the place from which we started to march. More or less here is the Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free gate, which is one of the critical elements of memory construct today. Our march here, because of the pandemic, started here from this corner of the camp. Then this is the gravel pit. Next to it is the building of Viertelgebäude. Then we marched a little bit on to see the building of the Lagerhaus. Then we marched here to see the SS Küche building, so the SS kitchen. And then this complex of buildings here are the warehouses, the one from which Zilla Cebulska and Jerzy escaped. And then you got the two administrative buildings, so the Stabsgebäude. Then we were walking through here. This is today the main entry building into the museum exhibit. And then we continued down this path to enter into the abandoned Union Worker factory. You can see how many other factories were somewhere in this fast-growing territory. And then from the Union Worker factory, following the rail, we entered into the bridge passing over the rail system and making a little detour from this normally straight path towards the gate. We've entered briefly into something which was called the Alte Judenrampe, the old Jewish unloading platform. And from here we marched on the Black Road to find ourselves in front of the second iconic site of Auschwitz memory, so the gate on the entrance to Auschwitz to Birkenau. Looking at this aerial picture, you can see the scale and the difference in scale. Auschwitz I, even after enlarging the buildings and adding second stories, there were altogether 28 barracks. Auschwitz I is accommodating a little bit over 20,000 of inmates at once. Birkenau, within this capacity, that's the gate of the so-called B1 section, B2 section, B3 section. This concentration camp is accommodating close to 90,000 of slave workers at one time. Behind this line somewhere, the German Nazis in 1942 are deciding to locate the death camp. You can see here crematorium gas chamber number 2, crematorium gas chamber number 3, and then crematorium gas chamber number 4 and 5. The largest, the most technologically advanced that were ever built by the German Nazi engineering on the path to murder. On the path to murder. So here, also using this aerial picture, you can very clearly see this incriminating proximity. Something I was already describing, a certain planning mistake of building a huge concentration camp for 90,000 of inmates and growing in the full visibility of a mass extermination complex. But as I said, when this decision is taken in 1942, the German Nazis are in full sense of victory and in full sense of not even thinking in terms of having to explain anything in the future. This changes. By 1943-44, they are gaining awareness about this planning mistake, and they are introducing a whole system of limitations in order to limit the number of eyewitnesses, both from the inmates themselves, but also from the camp staff itself. So this is made ready for summer 42, and this is becoming the first women's section. Then it extends here for men. But then in 1943 this is not enough, so they extend the camp this direction. In 1943 they are already losing this war, so they can no longer provide construction materials like bricks or steel. They have to economize. So what are they bringing here? They are deciding to bring here prefabricated stables for horses, which were used by the German army. And they were just setting up one by one after another, on this extended territory of Birkenau. It's a kind of a concentration camp out of the box. Build it fast, build it cheap. At the stage of this decision in 1943, the German Nazi administration has a full awareness that the human life here is worthless. An inmate is a number. The only thing that the inmate is worth is either the 4 Reichsmarks in case of an unqualified, or 8 Reichsmarks in case of a qualified worker daily shift in one of the factories. This is into what life is reduced in this economic system of exploitation of Auschwitz. So this extends in 1943, and then in 1944 they are starting to extend one more field like this. The so-called third part of Birkenau is being extended. This territory, this direction was administrative. At the end of this path there is a very similar building to the gate itself, which is still existing. Behind it, non-existing anymore, were the barracks and a lazarette and the barracks for soldiers and all kinds of facilities to make the life of Auschwitz staff benign, normal, cultural, pleasant, family-oriented, entertainment-oriented. The camp, as a good corporation, has to think about its workers. We know today that in this entire cycle of Auschwitz existence of 5 years, there were in between 8 to 9,000 of differently ranked SS soldiers and officers that were servicing the camp in different levels of the camp structure. This needs to be contrasted with another number. Up until today, there's a little bit over 200 of Auschwitz SS staff members that were ever put into any trial. And as you can imagine, we are probably not expecting to put many more. So we have a problem. We have a problem, and it's not only a historical problem, but it's our contemporary problem of a certain shortage of law and shortage of cultural patterns to deal and process genocides, to find justice after genocides, to bring the society back into order after genocides. We are still learning that. And committing mistakes and trying again. So we came here to this very far end of our march, a very far end of Auschwitz to Birkenau. After covering around 4 kilometers, about 2 miles, we've reached to the place which seems to be empty. We've reached to the place which, in spite of the fact that I was stressing all the time that the thing that matters here, especially for memory, is the physicality, is the preservation, is the protection, is the fact that the museum on a daily basis is involved into this protection so that we can see, meaning understand. Auschwitz is also about certain voids. It's about certain things invisible. So as much as I was trying to prove that the physicality matters, there's also one more reality that matters even more in case of Birkenau, and it's a certain void. So here we are in the very back part of Birkenau, facing an empty field. A field which is seemingly empty. We are facing a certain void, a void which we cannot transcend. Because we are right now facing one of the most important sites in Auschwitz-Birkenau, a site which is making this place even more meaningful than the German Nazi camp only, in a concentration of death. We are facing a cemetery. In all the convoluted and sometimes contradicting functions of Auschwitz, of being a commemorative site, a protective site, education site, probably the most important function, which at the same time is the least visible, is the fact that it's a cemetery. It's one of the largest cemeteries in the world. And we are just facing one of the massive burial fields into which at first the corpses, then the ash of the victims of Auschwitz as a concentration camp, and then from 42 Auschwitz as a death camp, were buried. And they are still here. It's still Beit Farod. So voids also matter. Auschwitz-Birkenau generated a certain void and discontinuity in European history, that's for sure. And it wasn't a void only in European Jewish history, it was a void in general European history. Yes, we all live today in a post-genocidal society, and we were all deprived today of certain potential that was taken away from us by Auschwitz. And as much as we think it's history, it's not history. It's only 70 few years ago. It's not even one full generation yet. We sometimes self-convince ourselves for our own comfort and sense of security that it is history. But at the same time we can see that certain phenomena, certain hate speech, certain attempt of building more authoritarian states is happening on our eyes. Certain lack, either deliberate or coincidental, bypassing and lack of rationality, especially lack of rationality in politics, we are going to learn this last lesson. This last lesson, which is probably the best phrased by the survivors themselves. In everything they are trying to communicate to us over the last decades, it very often summarizes into the words of Primo Levi, in which he is making a very brief statement. All we are trying to say is that it happened to us. And if it happened to us, it means that it may happen again.